Ever had someone tell you to stay tuned after a juicy bit of news? Well, today's deep dive is like that stay tuned moment, but instead of commercials, we're diving head first.
Into the USAGM.
Exactly. The U.S. Agency for Global Media, the folks behind Voice of America.
And let me tell you their story.
It's way more interesting than your average radio drama.
It really is. What captivates me about the USAGM is this balancing act they're tasked with. Promoting American ideals on a global stage, but also navigating the...
Often murky, let's be honest.
Yeah, the often murky waters of international diplomacy. And they're doing all of this with a budget that would make your eyes water.
We're talking $1 billion.
$1 billion. But the question is, are they hitting the mark or just making a splash with taxpayer money?
Okay, so let's unpack this. We've got mountains of research here, congressional testimonies, leaked memos, you name it, and it paints a picture of an organization wrestling with its own identity.
Absolutely.
Are they a news source, a diplomacy tool, a Cold War relic clinging to relevance in the age of Twitter?
It's a bit of all of those things, which is what makes it so fascinating. I mean, their official line is all about promoting freedom and democracy through unbiased news.
Sounds pretty noble, right?
Right. Spreading the good word, democracy, freedom, apple pie.
Apple pie, exactly.
The whole shebang. But, and this is a big but, some critics argue that the execution, that's where things get a little messy.
Okay.
They say the agency sometimes misses the mark on presenting a balanced view of America and its policies, and there's this fear that instead of boosting America's image,
they could be doing the opposite.
They might inadvertently be giving fuel to, rival nations' propaganda machines.
Ooh, that's got to sting a little bit.
Yeah.
So we're talking about more than just broadcasting news here. It's about shaping global perceptions.
Precisely. And nowhere is that more apparent than with, I'd say, the USAGM's most well-known entity, Voice of America, VOA.
VOA, sure. Practically a household name. Everyone's heard of it. What's the issue there?
Well, there have been accusations of VOA pushing biased content, and not just internationally. We're talking right here on American soil, which
you're not supposed to.
A big no-no. And to make matters worse, there's evidence they even purchased campaign ads during a presidential election.
Hold on. I thought they weren't allowed to target Americans with their broadcasting. That's like a major rule violation, right?
Bingo. They're supposed to be bound by something called the Smith-Mundt Act, which essentially draws a line in the sand between international outreach and meddling in domestic affairs. So VOA playing in the political sandbox like that, it raises serious questions about, overstepping boundaries and potentially trying to influence U.S. elections.
It's like they're trying to be the referee and a player in the game at the same time.
Exactly.
And something tells me that never ends well. But VOA... that's just one piece of the USAGM puzzle right now. Didn't you say they have a whole network of these broadcasters?
You're right. Focusing solely on VOA would be like reading the first chapter of a book and thinking, the whole story.
Right.
The USAGM oversees this complex web of broadcasters, each with their own set of targets, challenges, and, yes, controversies.
Okay, so give us the rundown. What are these other players and what kind of hot water are they in?
Well, one particularly fascinating case is the Office of Cuba Broadcasting. They're engaged in this constant battle, this constant struggle to deliver uncensored news to the Cuban people, but they're constantly battling not only budget cuts, but also, according to some sources, internal pushback within the USAGM itself.
Wow, so it's like they're trying to put out a fire while someone keeps dumping gasoline on it. What about Radio Free Europe, Radio Free Asia? I feel like those names always come up when we talk about international broadcasting.
Right. They're both broadcasting into regions with incredibly restrictive media landscapes, so their work is vital. But they've also had their share of controversy. Accusations of espionage, misusing funds. It's a minefield.
Yeah, I bet.
And then there's this curious case of the Open Technology Fund.
Okay, the Open Technology Fund, I've heard that name before. Give me a little refresher.
So their whole mission is centered around promoting internet freedom, so funding technology to break through censorship firewalls,
Sounds great on the surface. Who doesn't love the idea of a free and open internet?
Exactly. But, and this is a big but, critics are calling it a colossal waste of money, a boondoggle, as some have said, riddled with security flaws and a lack of transparency.
Oh, no.
And some even suggest that they're duplicating the work that's already being done by the USAGM's Office of Internet Freedom.
Now, wait a minute. So they created a whole separate entity to do something another part of the USAGM was already doing. That sounds incredibly inefficient.
That's the heart of the criticism, right? It speaks to a pattern of questionable spending and unnecessary duplication within the USAGM that has a lot of people demanding reform.
My head is already spinning, and we're just getting started. So we've got potential bias in reporting, we've got these security risks with the Open Technology Fund, possible overspending. Is there anything going right at the USAGM? Give me some good news.
Now, hold on. It's not all doom and gloom.
Okay.
There are passionate defenders of the agency's mission and its impact. They point to, the tireless dedication of individual journalists, many of whom are risking their safety.
Right, putting their lives on the line.
Exactly, to deliver this news, and the vital role that these broadcasts play in challenging authoritarian narratives, giving a voice to the voiceless, so to speak.
Okay, so there's our glimmer of hope in this whole USAGM saga. So it's not all just bureaucratic chaos and questionable spending.
Not at all. But those glimmers, they are often overshadowed by some serious concerns about how the agency operates. And these concerns are coming not just from outside observers, but more alarmingly, from insiders, people who have worked within the agency.
Ooh, insiders, whistleblowers. This is where things get juicy.
You said it. These insiders are raising major red flags about everything from security lapses, and we're talking about lapses that could potentially allow foreign intelligence agencies to infiltrate the USAGM.
Oh, wow. That's a big deal.
To, and this is maybe even more alarming, what they describe as a culture of resistance against protecting their own journalists, even those working in dangerous parts of the world.
Okay, protecting your own people, especially the ones who are out there, putting themselves in harm's way to report from these hotspots around the world. That should be a no-brainer. Why on earth would there be pushback from within the USAGM on that?
That's the million-dollar question, and frankly, it's one that's baffled a lot of observers. Some whistleblowers suggest it boils down to this fundamental misunderstanding of what journalistic independence actually means.
Okay.
Like they believe that, by acknowledging the need for security measures, they're somehow admitting that their reporting isn't truly objective.
So it's like this weird, catch-22.
Exactly.
How can you be objective if you're, not around to report on anything?
Right. It's like refusing to wear a seatbelt because it cramps your style.
Right, exactly.
It makes no sense. And it's frustrating, this disconnect, between their stated mission and then their actions. And it becomes even more troubling when you factor in those allegations of financial mismanagement and wasteful spending that we talked about earlier.
Right, the money. We can't let the billion-dollar budget just slide by here.
Yeah, where is all that money going?
Exactly. Where is it going, if not towards basic safety measures for your own people?
Right. It's a billion-dollar question, literally. And the critics are adamant that, the USAGM could achieve its goals on a fraction of its current budget if it just tightened its belt a little bit and got serious about financial responsibility.
Okay, but what does that look like practically? What could they be doing differently?
Well, for starters, many experts point to these redundant services as a prime example. Remember how we were talking about, VOA and Radio Free Asia both having Mandarin language services?
Right, overlapping services.
Or VOA and Radio Free Europe, both broadcasting in Farsi. This duplication of effort isn't just inefficient.
Yeah.
It's costing taxpayers a fortune.
So are they just throwing money at the problem, hoping it goes away?
It seems that way sometimes. And then there's the whole controversy surrounding the J-1 visa program.
Okay, the J-1 visa program, I've heard whispers about this. Break it down for me. What are these visas, and why is everyone up in arms about how the USAGM is using them?
So J-1 visas are designed with, cultural exchange programs in mind, right? So academic research, short-term internships, that kind of thing.
Okay.
The purpose being to foster, global understanding, cooperation, all that good stuff. However, there's growing concern that the USAGM is using these visas to essentially hire foreign journalists for positions that could easily be filled by qualified Americans.
So it's a job displacement issue.
That's the allegation, and it's created, as you can imagine, a lot of resentment among American journalists who feel like they're being unfairly edged out of opportunities.
Wow.
And it brings up concerns about exploitation of these J-1 visa holders.
Yeah, of course.
Especially when it comes to things like workplace protections and stuff like that.
Right. It's just layers upon layers of complexity here.
Layers. It's enough to make your head spin.
It really is.
Yeah.
And just when you think we've covered the most, tangled, knotted parts of this whole story, we got to talk about the elephant in the room.
Oh, here we go.
A firewall.
Yes. The infamous firewall. A constant source of debate and controversy within the agency.
It's a head-scratcher, for sure.
It is.
So as far as I understand it, This firewall is supposed to be like this crucial safeguard to ensure journalistic integrity, right?
Right.
Like this impenetrable barrier protecting journalists from any pressure to, toe the government line.
In theory, that is the idea, yes.
Okay.
But in reality, it's a lot more complicated, and some would argue it's become a bit of a double-edged sword.
How so?
Well, you have supporters of this firewall, and they argue that it's the only way to maintain the USAGM's credibility and prevent it from becoming, a puppet of,
A mouthpiece.
a mouthpiece exactly for whatever the administration's political agenda might be at the time. They argue that without it, their reporting would lose all legitimacy, especially in the eyes of these international audiences they're trying to reach.
Which makes sense if you think about it, right? Like if you're trying to, reach an audience that's already skeptical of government narratives, especially in countries that, may have a history of censorship or propaganda, you got to be able to build that trust.
Exactly. But here's where it gets messy. Critics argue that this firewall, which is supposed to be this symbol of journalistic integrity, has been, twisted and manipulated to create this culture of secrecy and a lack of accountability within the agency. Right. So it's less about protecting journalistic freedom and more about shielding biased content and potentially even misconduct from any kind of, outside scrutiny.
So it's like a shield that can be used for good or for evil, depending on who's, holding it.
Exactly, 100%. And to make matters worse, it doesn't sound like there's any clear consensus on how this firewall should even be interpreted or enforced.
So it's like this vague, mythical thing
Right.
that means different things to different people.
100%. And this lack of clarity, you can imagine, it leads to all sorts of problems.
Yeah.
Including, that whole debacle surrounding the firewall regulation during the Trump administration.
Oh, right. That was a whole thing. Refresh my memory on what exactly went down.
So, to make a long story short, the Trump administration, under the leadership of then CEO Michael Pack, they decided to revoke the firewall regulation.
Wow.
Their argument was that it was unlawful and that it was hindering the agency's ability to, fulfill its mission.
I can only imagine how well that went over.
It did not go well. It sparked a firestorm of criticism, from all sides. Journalist organizations, free press advocates, all accusing the Trump administration of basically trying to turn the USAGM into a propaganda machine and just completely, decimating its credibility on the world stage.
Wow. So what happened? Did it stay revoked, or what was the final outcome there?
Well, in classic Washington fashion, it got caught in this political back and forth.
Of course.
So the Biden administration comes in, they reverse course, they reinstate the firewall regulation, arguing that, it's absolutely essential for safeguarding journalistic independence.
Okay, so the firewall is back for now.
For now.
But it doesn't sound like those underlying tensions and questions about its purpose, its effectiveness, they haven't been resolved.
No.
If anything, it sounds like they're even more contentious now.
100%. And I think these tensions are just going to continue to resurface as the USAGM grapples with, its identity and its place in this rapidly evolving global media landscape.
Right.
I mean, think about it. The world is a much different place than it was during the Cold War.
Right.
And for the agency to really be effective, they've got to evolve and adapt.
It's like every time they try to fix one problem at the USAGM, another one pops up. Like they're juggling chainsaws while riding a unicycle on a tightrope.
That's a pretty accurate description, I'd say.
It really is.
And it just underscores how difficult it is to reform, a large bureaucratic organization.
Right.
Like the USAGM, especially one with a mandate this sprawling and a history as long and complicated as, like, a Russian novel.
Speaking of history, the world has changed drastically since the USAGM's early days back in the Cold War.
Oh, absolutely.
Back then, it was all about shortwave radio, reaching those behind the Iron Curtain.
Right.
Today, it's the internet, social media, this constant flood of information, misinformation, you name it.
Right, disinformation.
So, does the USAGM even have a place in this brave new world? Can they adapt, or are they destined to become a museum exhibit?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It feels like it.
There are those who would argue that, the USAGM is nothing more than a relic of a bygone era, a dinosaur in the digital age, and that, we should just cut our losses and shut it down.
Wow.
They say it's ineffective, it's a waste of taxpayer dollars, and it's completely out of touch with this modern media landscape that we're talking about.
Wow. So they're basically calling for the USAGM to be, sent out to pasture.
Yeah.
Time to pack it in and reminisce about the glory days of shortwave radio.
Well, not so fast.
Okay.
Because there is another side to this story.
Okay.
There are those who firmly believe that the USAGM, while undoubtedly flawed, still plays a vital role in, promoting American values. And countering this, tidal wave of disinformation that we're talking about, that's flooding the globe.
Right. Trying to, I don't know, put a little bit of truth out there in the world.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they argue that with some strategic reforms, a renewed commitment to innovation, the agency cannot just remain relevant,
Right.
but become even more essential.
So it's not a lost cause just yet?
Not yet. There's still a pulse.
Okay. But what would it take? What kind of reforms are we talking about? How can they possibly hope to adapt to this ever-evolving world of digital media and what some are calling, global information warfare?
Right, right. Well, for starters, many experts believe they've got to go all in on technology.
Okay.
And I'm not just talking about, sprucing up their website or getting hip to the latest TikTok trends.
Right. Got to be more than that.
Exactly. We're talking about they need to be pioneers in this space, developing cutting edge ways to, break through censorship barriers, reach audiences in those digital dark corners of the world where, freedom of information is under constant threat.
Because what good is a podcast if no one can listen to it?
Right. Precisely. And that's why some are calling for them to, get this, dust off an old tool from their arsenal. Shortwave radio.
Wait, seriously? Shortwave radio?
I know.
Isn't that what people used to listen to before the internet was even a thing?
I know. It sounds crazy.
Are we breaking out the ham radios? What are we doing?
Right. Well, you might be surprised to learn that shortwave radio actually has some surprising advantages in a world where internet access, can be spotty or unreliable or, easily disrupted.
Right, if the power goes out.
Exactly. For one, it's cheap. It can reach vast distances.
Right.
And it's way more difficult to censor.
Right, because it's just radio waves.
Exactly.
It's out there in the ether. So in a way, they could almost turn back the clock, use this old school technology to fight back against modern day censorship. Like something out of a spy movie or something.
Exactly. It's very retro.
Yeah.
But technology alone, it's not going to be enough to solve all their problems.
Okay.
They got to take a long, hard look in the mirror.
Right.
Address these internal issues that keep popping up, right?
Right.
Those security vulnerabilities we talked about.
Yeah.
The allegations of bias, mismanagement, lack of transparency, accountability, all that stuff we've been talking about.
Right. All the juicy bits.
Exactly.
It sounds like a major culture shift.
Yeah.
Maybe even a complete overhaul from the ground up.
At least.
Is that even possible with an organization like this?
Well, that's the I don't know if there's $1 million question for that, but it's a big one, right?
It's a biggie.
It's a biggie, and it kind of brings up another, I think, really crucial question, which is, even if they can get their act together, who's holding the reins here?
Right. Who's steering the ship?
Yeah.
Who sets the agenda?
Yeah.
Who decides how this very powerful broadcasting arm is wielded?
100%. And, they are a government agency.
Right. So the government's got to have some say, right?
You would think so, but, they're supposed to be editorially independent.
Right.
Meaning they should be free from political interference.
In a perfect world.
Right. That's the ideal.
Right.
But as we've seen, with this whole firewall debate.
Right. That line gets very blurry.
Very blurry, very quickly.
Yeah.
That line between, safeguarding journalistic integrity and navigating the, current political agendas, it gets very messy very quickly.
Yeah. And it's not just about, the current administration either.
Exactly.
It's everyone's got a dog in this fight.
Exactly. It plays out on multiple levels. You have, the White House, you have Congress, but then you also have these international organizations and even just, the individual journalists who are working within the agency itself.
So where does that leave us? Can the USAGM find its footing, find its voice in this, increasingly noisy and chaotic world?
Right.
Or is it just destined to become a footnote in the history of, media and international relations?
That's the ultimate question.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, I don't think there's an easy answer. I think the future of the USAGM, it's going to remain, a topic of debate, probably heated debate.
Right.
For years to come.
Of course.
But one thing is certain, and I think we can both agree on this, in an age where we are just drowning in information.
Right. Information overload.
And, grappling with the rise of digital manipulation, deep fakes, all of that.
Right.
The need for accurate, reliable, and truly independent sources of news.
Yes.
It's never been more critical.
It's paramount.
It really is.
Yeah.
So can the USAGM rise to meet that challenge? I don't know. Only time will tell.
Well, there you have it, folks. We journeyed into the heart of the USAGM, explored its history, its controversies, its challenges, and of course, its possible futures.
Lots of challenges.
And while we've only just scratched the surface of this very complex and often contradictory agency,
Right.
we hope you come away with a deeper understanding of, just what's at stake here in the world of international broadcasting.
It's a fascinating world, and, as we've discovered, it's rarely black and white. It's a world of nuance, of competing agendas,
Right.
where, often these high stakes and even higher ideals collide. And so, the next time you come across a news report from, Voice of America or any USAGM outlet for that matter,
Right.
just, take a moment to consider the source, the context.
Right. Think critically.
Think critically, exactly, about what you're reading, what you're listening to.
Absolutely.
You might be surprised by what you discover.
Words to live by.